AMD's high bandwidth cache controller protocol is one of the keystones to the Vega architecture, marked by RTG lead Raja Koduri as a personal favorite feature of Vega, and highlighted in previous marketing materials as offering a potential 50% performance uplift in average FPS when in VRAM constrained scenarios.
And you can see up to 50% average FPS improvement, and actually more importantly, almost 2x min FPS.
With a few driver revisions now behind us, we're revisiting our Vega 56 hybrid card to benchmark HBCC in A/B fashion, testing in memory-constrained scenarios to determine efficacy in real gaming workloads. Before getting to that, this content is brought to you by the Thermaltake Flow RGB closed-loop liquid cooler, which is a 360mm radiator plus 3 120 fans that are RGB illuminated, the Thermaltake Rain fans at that. This uses a 4.5 Gen Asetek pump, which is one of the faster pumps. You can learn more at the link in the description below. HBCC is the controller for AMD's high bandwidth cache, what the company has functionally renamed its VRAM 2. So there's no hard threshold as to what governs the high bandwidth cache naming. You could have, for example, a Vega GPU with GDDR5 memory, and if that hypothetical card existed, it would still be considered high bandwidth cache. It doesn't need to be HBM in order to be HBC under AMD's new naming scheme and the HBCC protocol. So this is a look at the HBCC controller, which is toggleable through the AMD drivers that is disabled by default. And we're using 17.10.1, but there is a new 17.10.2 driver set that just came out as we're filming this. We already did the testing though for 17.10.1, so the results are based on that. As for the cache controller, when enabled, the controller effectively converts VRAM into a last level cache and will tap into system memory as a sort of expanded video memory. In this scenario, if the applications page out of the on-card 8GB of HBM2, a trade-off between latency and capacity occurs, and the GPU taps into system memory to grab its needed pages. If you're storing 4K textures in HBM2 and exceed that 8GB capacity, for example, and then maybe need another 1GB for other assets, those items can be pushed onto system memory and then pulled via the PCIe bus. This is less effective than increasing on-card memory, but it's significantly cheaper than doing so, and it's not always possible to increase the on-card memory due to either physical space limitations or memory controller limitations, things like that. This is even in spite of DDR pricing right now, and expanding it to system memory isn't a new thing for really any type of technology when looking at IGPs and APUs, but it does enable Vega to potentially expand the working area for data when it's dealing with larger data sets, something that Vega has really targeted since the beginning. Latency is introduced by means of traveling across the PCIe interface through the CPU and down the memory bus and then back again, but it's still faster than having to dump memory and swap data locally. Hypothetically, this technology would permit large working datasets to exist on system memory and give the GPU's memory controller somewhat direct access to that dataset. Although it's worse for latency, technically speaking, the additional capacity should outweigh that latency deficit in the right scenarios. It's just going to take proper implementations to ever realize the gains, and that implementation must happen at both the software developer and AMD levels of deployment. AMD first showcased this technology in a tech demo in March, around when Ryzen was launching, and they showed HBCC on versus off with a hypothetical Vega card that didn't come to exist and probably won't, or at least not anytime soon. That card was a 4GB Vega GPU with an unspecified shader count. So it is a 4GB card as opposed to the modern 8 on both 64 and 56, and because it was 4GB, it was far more likely to become memory constrained than something with 8. It's pretty hard to fill an 8GB frame buffer with video games or even synthetic benchmarks, so it makes sense that in order to showcase the difference, you would do something like use a 4GB card. Unfortunately, we don't presently have a good way of constraining our cards to 4GB like in the tech demo, but we have some ideas potentially for the future. We'll see if they work or not though. But either way, when they showcased this, Deus Ex Mankind Divided showed the differences of about 50% in average FPS according to AMD, and a 100% improvement in minimums. So AMD showing averages got a 50% increase in performance by enabling HBCC, which expanded the effective VRAM, we'll call it, that Vega could tap into when working with the game's data set. That would include things like textures, for example. Now, this is disabled by default. It's been tested in the past around launch. We figured we'd revisit it with some newer drivers and see if anything's changed. We are using all the components defined in the article below, and the testing methods are there as well, along with all the components used. But for the most important components, 3200 megahertz of CL16 memory is being used. We have 32 gigabytes of it available to the system. And of that, depending on the scenario, we're expanding AMD Vega 56 VRAM allocation to an effective 18 gigabytes with HBCC on, except in Shadow of War, where we only expanded to 12 gigabytes because we wanted to make sure there was enough memory there to work with the 4K special texture pack, because there can be issues if not. It just won't load them, and you may not even notice it. So let's get started. We're looking at not just the theoretical, but the practical performance from HBCC, and that means we're looking primarily at gaming and at synthetic workloads. To really drill down into differences and build our accuracy and confidence, we first started with Firestrike and scripted execution of 20 test passes with HBCC on and HBCC off, using another in-house script to export and analyze all that data. There's some variance, but this many test passes will average it out. We plotted a standard deviation of 27.48 points with HBCC off and 35.8 points with HBCC on. As for the scoring, the HBCC off test scored 19,418.13 points, where HBCC on with 18 gigabytes allocation scored 19,683. This marks HBCC enablement as providing a 1.37 performance improvement over HBCC off, which manifests itself as a boost in FPS, which we've charted, of 93.8 FPS average versus 95.2 FPS average for GT1, and 76.8 versus 77.8 for GT2. Again, this is over 20 test passes for each benchmark, so we can be pretty certain that within the parameters of our test system and Windows, this is a repeatable difference and is outside of variance of just the Firestrike application. TimeSpy underwent the same treatment using the same script for its repeated execution. We found much closer scores for this one, with the average graphics score at 6062.3 for HBCC disabled, or 6094.37 for HBCC enabled. That grants HBCC an advantage of 0.53% repeatably and translates into a scoring of 41.7 FPS average versus 41.9 for GT1 and favoring HBCC enabled. It's also 33.2 FPS versus 33.39 for GT2, again favoring enabled. Superposition is our next synthetic test, offering a look at performance scaling from the eyes of Unigine rather than FutureMark. Superposition wasn't repeated as many times, but we do have 5 test passes for each configuration, with minor standard deviations of 2.9 points for HBCC on and 1.4 points for HBCC off, and this is on a scale of many thousands of points, so a deviation of 1 is really pretty good. This application is impressively consistent in scoring. HBCC off results in a score of 3484 points in superposition as opposed to 3624 with HBCC enabled, and that's at 1080p extreme. The performance difference amounts to a 4% improvement, which is the biggest we've measured thus far. Of course, we're so bound by other elements of the card, like the core frequency, streaming processors, ROPs, so forth, that a 4% improvement is only represented by a 1 FPS increase because we're just choking everywhere else and can't really realize that gain in a meaningful way. As for frequency, using stock settings, enabling HBCC plotted a stable frequency of about 1310 to 1325 megahertz for the first half of the test, while disabling HBCC plotted a more variable but higher frequency of 1315 to 1352 megahertz. This is repeatable and happened effectively every time, and we weren't really trying to control for that frequency change because we were interested in how the card behaved when HBCC was on versus off, and this was part of that behavior and observation of that behavior. Despite this slight frequency deficit on the HBCC-enabled test, it was a bit more consistent, and the card ultimately managed to improve performance by a few percentage points overall, looking like about 4 in this case. Sniper Elite 4 is our first game benchmark. At 4K with high settings, DirectX 12, and async compute, we found performance to be functionally equal between the HBCC A/B tests, with HBCC on plotting 52.7 FPS average, 46.21% lows, and 45.01% lows. Disabling HBCC landed us at 52.2 FPS average, a 0.5 FPS difference, 45.91% lows, and 44.8 FPS 0.1% lows. Not only is there no discernible difference, there's no difference outside of usual deviation and error margins, so we can't actually say whether there's an improvement here. It just kind of looks all the same. Moving to Ashes of the Singularity with DirectX 12, 4K resolution, and high settings, we mostly saw the same. These results had us at 66.6 FPS average to 66.9 FPS average with 44.3 to 43.5 1% lows and 41 versus 40 0.1% lows for the FPS. Once again, these are within test-to-test deviation. Ghost Recon Wildlands at 4K plots the HBCC tests at 36 FPS average with HPCC on and off, with lows largely tied at 33 and 32.5 or 32 and 31.8 FPS. So all pretty much the same numbers. There's no appreciable difference here, and we are once again within variance. We also saw no difference at 1080p, though that's less significant given the diminished focus on memory at this resolution, but pretty much the same results if you were curious about 1080p. For Honor at 4K and using extreme settings makes for one of the more memory-intensive real-world games that we work with. Vega with HBCC enabled plotted a 43 FPS average versus 42.7 when disabled, marking these scores functionally equivalent and within variance. The lows are 40.7 FPS versus 40.3 and 39.3 0.1% lows versus 38. Once again, all of this is within test deviation and variance for this particular title. At 1080p, For Honor has us at 125 FPS average for both HBCC enabled and disabled. We would expect less likelihood for differences to emerge at these lower resolutions given the VRAM usage reduction. We configured Hellblade to 4K with very high settings, providing one of the more taxing games for testing a Vega 56 card. Under both HBCC conditions, performance was exceptionally consistent and plotted about the same numbers between HBCC on and off once again for Hellblade at 4K. Testing Shadow of War with the normal texture pack, 4K resolution, and high settings, we were at 42 to 43 FPS average on both iterations of the HBCC testing, marking equal performance once again. We later enabled the 4K texture pack and ran ultra settings, with HBCC reconfigured to a 12GB frame buffer to preserve RAM for the pack, just in case. Those settings gave us, once again, about the same performance between our HBCC on and off tests. Consulting the work of friend of the site Rob Williams over at TechGauge, it looks like they found pretty much the same results when the card first shipped, or close to it anyway. Their results, for the most part, featured basically the same plus or minus 1 FPS within error types of differences, and they did also test Mankind Divided, which we didn't do for this one, and TechGauge didn't measure any meaningful change with the 8GB Vega cards, but like we were saying at the beginning of this content, the article and the video, it looks like perhaps there would be a bigger difference if you could restrict Vega to 4GB. So this HBCC control, the toggle for the controller, may come into play more if either a 4GB Vega card comes into existence, which would be an awfully interesting combination. The price of HBM at 4GB, I don't know, we'll see if it works out, if it ever actually exists. But that would be a scenario where you would potentially see a difference. AMD certainly showed that in their tech demo. We can't recreate it because we only have the cards that exist on the market, which are 8GB. And the other option would be potentially if somehow games just started storing tons and tons of data into VRAM in the immediate future, or maybe if you resurrect these cards in several years when probably they are end of life for various other reasons, maybe at that point, because of technology changes and shifts in game development, you might see implementation of, or actually utilization rather, of that expanded memory or effective memory on the video card. What we haven't tested is production level applications. I'm not sure if TechGauge has tested that yet or if they plan to, but production applications are a potential area where there might also be gains. AMD has its own SSG solution for that space, particularly with things like live 8K scrubbing and Premiere with the SSG Radeon cards. So there may be some kind of impacts in production level workloads. But for gaming, we're not really seeing anything right now in the games we've tested. It does look like Superposition plots a somewhat statistically significant change in that we're seeing a 4% uplift with HBCC. The only problem there is that by the time we're tapping into that advantage, the extra 4% advantage, we're so limited elsewhere in the pipeline that it's just, as a player, if you could play the game Superposition, if it were a game, at the point that the advantages coming into play are already at such a low FPS that it's unplayable anyway, so you'd actually be better off just lowering your settings, sacrificing the advantage, and running with something that's a bit easier for the card to work with. The exception would be if you had a workload that had a very memory-intensive set of assets, like maybe 8K textures or something. We haven't tried, for example, modding Fallout or Skyrim. If any of you have, let us know what your results were. But those would be scenarios where you could definitely pump the memory usage on the video card with user-created assets that are, one, less optimized, and two, don't have the same considerations that game developers have in terms of capacity, console compatibility, things like that, so they can go heavier on the memory consumption on the video card. So those would be all the scenarios where you might see an uplift. For the stuff we've tested thus far, we're not seeing one, so don't worry about that toggle right now. It's not really worth turning it off. You don't really get a performance hit unless you run into issues with system memory limitations. So from what we've seen, you could probably turn it on and maybe every now and then you'll get a 0.5 to 4% performance uplift. It's not really a bad thing, but if you do encounter stability issues, obviously it's also not a bad thing to just turn it off and live without it. So one of those things where the technology is there and it's kind of questionable when it works, but it seems to work in some instances, particularly synthetic. So those might be enough to encourage turning it on, but it's certainly not a silver bullet for anything. So that's all for this one. We'll revisit this as more driver updates and games and applications seem like they're using it. Wolfenstein 2 will be a potential option for looking into this because Bethesda has sort of cryptically stated that they will be leveraging Vega to greater levels than other games do currently, probably just because of Vulkan, but we'll see. As always, you can go to patreon.com/gamersnexus to help us out directly, or store.gamersnexus.net to pick up a shirt like this one. Thank you for watching. Subscribe for more. We'll see you all next time. But for the most important components, 3200 megahertz of it's very loud thunder.